You know what's interesting about the whole empath conversation? Everyone talks about being an empath like it's this permanent identity, this fixed state of being where you're just destined to absorb everyone's emotions forever. But when you actually spend time with Jung's work, you start to realize he saw something completely different happening. He wasn't interested in keeping people trapped in sensitivity. He was interested in what happens when someone who feels everything finally learns to transform that gift into something else entirely. I spent years going through Jung's collected work, his letters, his case studies, and there's this thread that runs through everything he wrote about highly sensitive people. He never used the word empath because that wasn't the language of his time, but he absolutely understood the type. He called them different things depending on the context. Sometimes they were the ones with thin boundaries between conscious and unconscious. Sometimes they were the feeling types who hadn't developed their thinking function. But regardless of what he called them, he saw them as people standing at a crossroad, not people stuck in a permanent state. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Jung believed that if you stay in that raw empathic state, if you remain as someone who just absorbs, feels, and takes on everyone else's content, you're actually stuck in a mature cycle. That's going to bother people because we've built entire identity in being empath. We've made it our personality, our explanation for why relationships are hard, our badge of honor, and our excuse all wrapped in one. But Jung looked at that state and said, this is where you start, not where you're supposed to stay. The healed empath in Jung's framework becomes something called the individuated person. And that's not just a fancy word for someone who feels better about being sensitive. Individuation is this brutal, gorgeous process where you stop being a container for everyone else's psychological content and start becoming a person with clear boundaries who can be in the presence of intensity without losing themselves. You transform from someone who feels everything into someone who can feel deeply but chooses what they carry. Think about what happens to most people who identify as empaths. They walk into a room and immediately pick up on tension, sadness, anger, whatever's floating around in the emotional atmosphere. Then they do this thing where they absorb it, they take it into their own system, and they walk around carrying emotional content that isn't even theirs. They'll feel anxious and not know why. They'll feel drained after being around certain people. They'll need 2 days to recover from a family dinner. And the common narrative is that this is just how empaths are built, that this is the price of the gift. Jung would have pushed back hard on that. He'd say you're not actually empathizing in those moments. You're merging. You're losing the boundary between self and other, and that's not a gift, that's a wound that hasn't healed yet. Real empathy, mature empathy, requires you to feel with someone while maintaining your separate self. It requires you to understand their pain without taking their pain into your body and making it yours. I remember reading one of Jung's case studies about a woman who came to him completely overwhelmed by what she felt from others. She thought she was cursed with too much feeling, and Jung's approach wasn't to help her feel less, it was to help her develop what he called the thinking function, the part of the psyche that can observe and analyze, create distance. When he helped her build an inner observer who could say, that's their anger, not mine, or I'm feeling their anxiety, but I don't have to become anxious. That observer, that witnessing consciousness, that's what creates the transformation. The uncomfortable truth is that most people who identify as empaths are actually dealing with underdeveloped boundaries and an overactive shadow. Jung talked about the shadow as all the parts of ourselves we haven't integrated, all the feelings and traits we've rejected or denied. And here's what happens with a lot of highly sensitive people. They've learned to reject their own anger, their own selfishness, their own need, because those things felt dangerous or unacceptable. So they push all of that into the shadow, and then they become hyper-aware of those exact qualities in other people. You're not just feeling everyone's emotions because you're naturally gifted at it. You're often feeling them because you're unconsciously looking for the parts of yourself you've disowned. The empath who's always around angry people hasn't just attracted angry people by accident. They're unconsciously drawn to anger because their own anger is in the shadow, unfelt and unexpressed. The empath who's always trying to fix sad people is often running from their own unprocessed grief. Jung called this projection, and it's one of the main reasons highly sensitive people suffer so much. When you start to heal as an empath, when you start to individuate in Jung's terms, you have to do the shadow work. You have to reclaim your anger, your selfish, your right to say no, your capacity to be indifferent to someone else's problem. That sounds harsh, but it's actually a path to freedom, because once you've integrated rejected part, once you've made peace fact that you contain all of it, the full spectrum of human experience, you stop projecting so intensely. You stop needing to merge emotion because you're no longer searching for lost parts of self. The healed empath becomes someone Jung would call whole, not perfect, not in light whole. They've gathered up all the scattered pieces of themselves, including the piece that seemed too dark, too self-too. And from that place of wholeness, they can actually be present with others in a completely different way. They can sit with someone's pain without need to fix, absorb it. They can witness someone's anger without becoming defensive or taking it personally. They can love people without losing themselves. Jung had this idea that really challenged me when I first encountered it. He said the goal of psychological development isn't to become more connected to others, it's to become more connected to yourself, to your own inner center. And from that solid center, from that place of being genuinely anchored in your own psyche, you can actually connect with others in a much healthier way. But most empaths are trying to connect outward before they've connected inward, and that's why they end up depleted and confused and unable to tell where they end and someone begin. There's this letter Jung wrote where he talked about the difference between identification and relationship. He said, when you identify with someone, when you merge with their emotional state, you've actually lost the ability to relate to them, because relationship requires two separate people. It requires an I and a you, not a blurred we where nobody knows who's feeling what. The healed empath learns to maintain the I even in the presence of intense emotion from the other. They learn to feel with instead of feel as. This transformation doesn't happen overnight, and it's not comfortable. Jung was very honest about the fact that individuation, becoming a whole person, is often a lonely and difficult process. Because as you start to develop boundaries, as you start to say no to absorbing everyone's emotions, people notice. The people who were used to you being their emotional support animal get uncomfortable. The relationships that were based on you being endlessly available start to shift or end. And there's this period where you feel like maybe you're becoming cold or selfish because you're not responding to everyone's needs the way you used to. But that's not what's actually happening. What's happening is you're becoming an individual instead of a sponge. You're developing what Jung called a strong ego. And that doesn't mean arrogance. It means you have a stable sense of self that doesn't dissolve the presence of other people. You know what you feel, what you need, and you can hold on to it even when someone else is falling apart next to you. Jung believed the individuated person, the healed empath, becomes capable of what he called the transcendent function. This is the ability to hold opposites in tension without collapsing into one side or the other. You can feel deep compassion for someone while also maintaining clear boundaries. You can understand why someone is behaving badly while also refusing to tolerate that. You can love someone and still choose not to be in relation. These paradoxes, these both and reality, become accessible once you've done the work of integration. And here's something I noticed in Jung's work that really changed how I thought about empath. He talked about how the people feel the most, who are the most sensitive to the collective unconscious and the emotional atmosphere around them, have a specific purpose. They're meant to be what he called media between the unconscious world. But they can only fulfill that purpose if they've individuated, if they've become strong enough to translate what they're feeling without being destroyed. The unhealed empath is just overwhelmed by the unconscious content flooding through them. They're drowning in feelings and images and intuitions that they can't process or understand. But the healed empath, the individuated, becomes like a channel that's been cleared. They can receive the information, the emotional truth, the collective pain or joy, and they can bring it into consciousness in a way that's useful. They become artists, therapists, teachers, writers, people who can take the formless feeling content and give it form that others can work with. That's what Jung really thought happened to healed empath. They don't stop being sensitive. They become alchemists who can transform sensitivity into insight, into art, into healing themselves and others. But that transformation requires they first stop identifying as victims of sensitivity and start seeing it as raw material that needs to be worked with, shaped, integrated, a larger sense of self. The process Jung described isn't about learning techniques or adopting new habits, even though that's how we tend to approach everything now. It's about a fundamental shift in how you relate to your own psyche. Most empaths are living in what Jung called participation mystique, this state where there's no clear separation between inner and outer, between self and world. You feel bad, and you assume it's because someone near you feels bad. You walk into a room and absorb the atmosphere and think that atmosphere is now your emotional reality. You're participating in everyone else's psychological state without even realizing you have a choice not to. Jung saw this participation mystique as a primitive state of consciousness, and I know that sounds judgmental, but he didn't mean it as an insult. He meant it developmental. It's where human consciousness begins, in this merged state with the mother, with the tribe, with the collective. Babies live in participation mystique. They can't tell where they end and the world begins. And some people, particularly those with the empathic temperament, stay closer to that original merged state their whole lives. They never fully separate. They never complete what Jung called the process of psychological birth. The healing happens when you finally individuate out of that merged state, when you realize that you are not your mother's sadness, even though you've been carrying it since childhood. You are not your partner's anxiety, even though you feel it in your body every day. You are not the collective fear or rage or grief that's moving through the culture right now, even though you're incredibly sensitive to it. You're you, this distinct center of consciousness that can perceive all of that without becoming all of that. But here's where Jung's work gets really challenging. He said that to individuate, to become a healed and whole person, you have to betray the collective. You have to stop living according to what your family expect, what your culture, what the people around you to be. And for empath, this feels almost impossible because empaths are usually the built entire identity on meeting other people, around being what others require to be. I've thought about this a lot because it explains why so many empaths stay stuck. It's not that they don't know they need boundaries, it's that establishing real boundaries feels like a moral failure, like they're abandoning people who need them. Jung would say that's exactly the problem. You've confused your psychological development with your moral worth. You think being a good person is being available to every pain, and so you sacrifice your own individuation on the altar of being helpful. The truth Jung kept pointing to is that you can't actually help anyone from that merged, unindividuated state. You think you're helping, but what you're really doing is enabling, absorbing, carrying what other people need to carry themselves. You're preventing their individuation by doing their emotional work, and you're preventing your own individuation by never developing a strong enough self to stand separate from others. There's this concept in Jung's work called the wounded healer, and it's gotten misunderstood over the years. People think it means you heal others through your wounds, that your suffering gives you special access to other people's suffering. But that's not quite what Jung meant. He meant that you have to heal your own wounds first. You have to individuate and become whole, and then from that healed place you can help us heal. The wound teaches you, but it's the healing of the wound that qualifies you to be useful to anyone else. Most empaths are operating as wounded healers in the wrong direction. They're trying to heal others while their own wounds are still wide open and bleeding. They're giving from an empty place, absorbing from a place of psychological poverty. And then they wonder why they're exhausted, why they're resentful, why they keep attracting people who drain them. Jung would say you're attracting exactly what you need to attract, to force you to finally do your own, finally stop and stuff. When you actually study Jung's case, you see him constantly pushing comfort toward the parts of themselves they've been avoiding. He had patients who were too nice, too accommodating, too sensitive to others. His therapeutic approach was often to help them access their aggression, their self-capacity to not care. That sounds counterintuitive, but Jung understood that these rejected qualities were essential parts of wholeness. The healed empath has integrated what Jung called the inferior function. For feeling types, which is what most empaths are, the inferior function thinking is the ability to step back, analyze, make logical decisions that might hurt someone's feeling but are necessary anyway. Unhealed empaths are all feeling and no thinking. They make decisions based entirely on emotional impact, on who might be hurt or pointed. They can't access the cold, rational part of themselves that can say this relationship isn't working, this job is destroying me, this person is toxic regardless of their sad backstory. Jung believed you had to develop all four functions: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition to become whole. Most empaths have overdeveloped feeling and intuition and completely underdeveloped thinking and sensation. They're floating in emotional and intuitive space with no grounding, no logic, no ability to deal with concrete reality. The healing process involves deliberately developing those inferior functions, even though it feels unnatural and uncomfortable. I remember reading Jung's work on the persona and realizing how much empaths struggle with this. The persona is the social mask we wear, the version of ourselves we present to the world. Jung said a healthy persona is flexible. You can put it on when you need it and take it off when you don't. But empaths often have either no persona at all, they're just raw and exposed all the time, or they have a persona that's completely taken over and they've lost touch with who they really are underneath it. The empath with no persona is the one who overshares, who has no filter, who tells their whole life story to strangers because they feel everything so intensely they can't contain it. The empath with the rigid persona is the one who's always playing the role of the helper, the good listener, the one who's got it together, and they've completely lost access to their actual feelings and needs underneath that mask. Both versions are unindividual. Both need to find the middle path where you have a functional social self that protects your inner world without cutting you off from it. Jung's concept of the self with a capital S is where this all leads. The self isn't your personality or your ego or your emotions. It's this deeper organizing center of the psyche that includes but transcends all of those things. The individuated person has made contact with the self. They're no longer just living from the ego, from the small self that's reactive and defensive and constantly threatened. They're living from this deeper place that can witness the ego, that can hold all the contradictions and complexity of being human without falling apart. For the healed empath, this means you stop identifying as just an empath. That label becomes too small, too limiting. You're a person who has the capacity for deep feeling. Yes, but you're also so much more than. You have the capacity for logic, for groundedness, for healthy selfishness, for indifference when indifference is appropriate. You contain multitudes, as Jung believed all individuated people do. And from that expanded sense of self, you can move through the world in a completely different way. The transformation also involves what Jung called the integration of the anima or animus, a contrasexual aspect of the psyche. For empaths who are women, this often means integrating the animus, the masculine principle of assertion, boundaries, rational thinking, the ability to cut and separate. For empaths who are men, it means integrating the anima in a healthy way, not being flooded by it, but having conscious access to feeling and intuition without losing their masculine groundedness. Jung was really clear that you can't skip steps in this process. You can't just decide to have boundaries and suddenly be individuated. You have to go through what he called the confrontation with the unconscious. You have to face your shadow, your rejected parts. You have to see how much of your empathic sensitivity is actually projection and unprocessed trauma. You have to feel the grief of separating from the collective, from the family system, from the role you play. You have to sit with the guilt becoming selfish, even though it's not actually selfish, it's self-preservation. This is why Jung said individuation often happens in the second half of life. It takes that long for most people to be ready to. Young empaths are usually still trying to make state, still trying to be every, still but their sensitivity are, and they have to accept the suffering comes with its usual exhaust fail breakdown that someone's ready for. The turning point Jung identified happens when the suffering becomes greater than the fear of change. Most empaths stay in their patterns because even though those patterns are painful, they're familiar. You know how to be the person everyone needs. You know how to absorb and accommodate and adjust yourself to whatever emotional weather is happening around you. You've been doing it since childhood, probably because that's how you survived in whatever family system you grew up in. Changing that pattern means stepping into unknown territory where you don't know who you'll be if you're not the sensitive one, the helper, the emotional translator for everyone else. Jung wrote about this threshold moment in almost mystical terms. He called it the night sea journey, this descent into the unconscious where you have to face everything you've been running from. For empath, that journey involves facing the reality that much of what you call empathy has actually been codependent, enmeshment, a desperate attempt to control others by managing their emotional state. That's brutal to admit because empaths generally see themselves as selfless, as giving, as almost noble in their suffering. But Jung would push you to look deeper and ask, what are you getting out of this? What does staying merged with others protect you from having to face about yourself? Often what empaths are avoiding through all that outward focus is their own inner emptiness, their own unprocessed trauma, their own fear of being alone with themselves. If you're always tuned into everyone else's frequency, you never have to sit with your own. If you're always busy feeling other people's feelings, you never have to feel your own all the way through. Jung saw this pattern clearly. He saw how people use external focus, even when it looks like compassion or sensitivity, as a defense against the terrifying work of turning inward. The healed empath has made that inward turn. They've spent time in what Jung called active imagination, this practice of dialoguing with the unconscious, of meeting the inner figures and voices and energies that live in the psyche. They've discovered that their inner world is vast and complex and endlessly interesting, and they don't need to be constantly plugged into other people's inner worlds to feel alive or purposeful. They've found the source of meaning inside themselves rather than always seeking it through connection to others. This is where Jung's work parts ways with a lot of contemporary psychology that emphasizes attachment attachment and relationship as the primary path to healing. Jung believed relationship was important, but he believed self-knowledge was more important. He thought you had to become a person first before you could really relate to anyone else. And for empaths who've built their entire sense of self around relationship, around being needed, around understanding others, this is a fundamental reorientation. What happens practically when an empath? They start noticing when they're absorbing versus when they're actually feeling their own feelings. They develop what Jung called the observing ego. This part of consciousness can step back and watch what's happening in the psyche without complete. So you walk into tense family dinner, and instead of immediately becoming anxious, there's a voice that says, I notice I'm picking up anxiety, but that anxiety isn't mine. I can observe it without taking it on. That observing capacity, it's the difference between being at the mercy of your sensitivity and being able to work with sensitivity tool. Jung spent his whole career trying to help people develop that observer. That witness consciousness creates just enough distance from the immediate emotional experience to allow for choice. Without that observer, you're just reactive, just blown around by whatever emotional content is near you. With it, you have agency. The healed empath also develops what Jung called a religious attitude toward life, and he didn't mean religious in the conventional sense. He meant a sense of connection to something larger than the personal ego, something that holds meaning even when individual circumstances are difficult. For a lot of empaths, this comes through finally recognizing that their sensitivity connects them to the collective unconscious, to the larger patterns and archetypes that move through all human experience. They stop taking everything so personally. They realize that the depression they're feeling might be their own, or it might be something collective that's moving through them, or it might be both at once. Jung talked about how individuated people become more porous to archetypal experience, while simultaneously becoming more boundaried with individual people. That sounds contradictory, but it's not. You become open to the big pattern, the mythic dimensions of human experience, the ways that your individual story connects to stories that have been playing out for thousands of years. But you stop letting your neighbor's bad mood ruin your afternoon. You stop absorbing your mother's anxiety as if it's your responsibility to fix it. You maintain clear boundaries with individuals while opening to something much larger. This transformation changes how empaths experience their gift. The sensitivity doesn't go away, but it becomes refined. Instead of feeling everything in an undifferentiated, overwhelming flood, you start to perceive distinct energy and patterns. You can sense when someone's anger is actually covering fear. You can feel when a relationship is ended before anyone says anything. You can walk into a space and immediately know what's needed without having to merge with the chaos to figure it out. Jung would say your intuitive function has become conscious and direct instead of unconscious and overwhelming. The healed empath can also finally access what Jung called the positive shadow, the good qualities that were repressed along with the bad ones. A lot of empaths have repressed their strength, their power, their capacity for leadership or visibility, because those things felt dangerous or likely to provoke rejection. They learned to make themselves small and accommodating and focused on others. Individuation means reclaiming those positive qualities, stepping into your full presence and power without apologizing for it. Jung had this idea that interested me deeply when I found it. He said the second half of life is about becoming who you actually are rather than who you were taught to be. For empaths, this often means a complete reversal of what seemed like core identity. You thought you were the person who feels everything and carries everyone, but maybe who you actually are is someone strong and boundaried who can feel deeply when they choose to, but isn't defined by or limited to that sensitivity. Maybe the empathic capacity is just one color in a much larger palette that you've been preventing yourself from accessing. The relationships in your life will change radically as you individuate. Some people will fall away because they were only connected to the unhealed version of you, the one who was always available to manage their emotions or listen to their problems or accommodate their needs. Those relationships will feel like losses, and Jung was honest that individuation involves grief. You're letting die the version of yourself that you and everyone else got comfortable with. You're disappointing people who need you to stay the same, because your sameness allows them to avoid their own work. But new relationships become possible from the individuated place. Relationships where you're met as an equal instead of functioning as someone's emotional support system. Relationships where there's space for both people to be complex and contradictory and not always available. Jung believed that real relationship only becomes possible between two individuated people because only then are there actually two separate people to relate? Everything else is just various forms of merging and projection and mutual use. The healed empath discovers they can be alone without being lonely. That's huge because unhealed empaths are often terrified of solitude. They need people around them, need emotional stimulation and connection because their own inner world feels empty or scary or just unknown. But Jung insisted that the capacity to be alone, to be self-contained, to find your inner well of meaning and energy, that's the foundation of psychological health. Once you have that, once you can sit with yourself in silence without needing to immediately reach out and plug into someone else's emotional field, you're free in a way you've never been before.